So let's just get into it. So my first TV show that I'm going to be talking about today, guys, we're talking about Waco, that Waco show that's on Netflix. If you're unfamiliar with the show, it's based off of the true life story of the Waco incident where down in Waco, Texas, there was this cult compound. They were known as the Branch Davidians, led by this guy named David. And the ATF shows up because they were kind of running sort of like an illegal gun operation, whether they're, in possession of illegal guns or I think they were just modifying guns without a permit. It's kind of, I'm not incredibly sure. I was kind of trying to read up on this situation, but we'll get into that a little bit later. But the ATF was there and shit kind of goes down, and then the FBI gets involved in it. It's this big standoff, and it's a pretty well-known true crime, true story type of standoff between the government and a private religious cult, basically. So it's a very interesting story. I recommend watching documentaries about it and true things. But let's get into the actual show itself. Really loaded cast. I'm talking some major players here. Michael Shannon. Let me tell you, Michael Shannon is one of my favorite actors, ever, and he's rarely in things. And whenever he is, he's quite fucking phenomenal in them, and he's the same. He's phenomenal here, and I just love. I wish all these actors were in more things. They're a bunch of actors, bunch of character actors that really aren't in a lot, but whenever they are, you're like, oh man, I love you, man. You're great. Why aren't you in more shit? Michael Shannon is definitely one of those. He plays Gary Nessner, an FBI negotiator, who gets involved with the whole standoff. Taylor Kitsch, if you're unfamiliar with him, he played Tim Riggins in Friday Night Lights. He was also in Lone Survivor. I would argue he's probably the only good thing in the second season of True Detective, other than Colin Farrell. Colin Farrell is also really good in that show as well, but that season kind of sucked in my opinion. Taylor Kitsch was probably one of the few bright spots of it. And then there's a lot of other unfamiliar names. There's a Julia Gardner. She's if you know her from she plays Ruth in Ozark. She's phenomenal. She's a minor role in this when her career was starting to get kind of get going a little bit, getting a little bit more roles. She got this one, and she's really good here. Rory Culkin is in this as well in a minor role. There's a lot of recognizable faces that you're like, oh, I know you. So not a lot of recognizable names, but recognizable faces. But performances, everyone brings it, and I will probably say now the acting is definitely the best part of the show. But we'll get into that a little bit. So, let's kind of get into the things that the show does really right. Like I said, the acting and the performances are top notch. Everyone brings it. Everyone is amazing. The directing is generally pretty good, but I'll kind of get in. That kind of leads a little bit into my criticism a little bit. It kind of brings out a little bit of my problems with the show. But the show is very well made. It's incredibly engaging. The characters are amazing. The writing is very amazing. Everything about the show is great as a show. But the problem with a show like this, and this is not very specific to this show. It's specific to shows like this that kind of follow a true story, true crime narrative, that a situation that actually happened. And obviously they have to take some creative liberties, and some things kind of get lost in translation, because the main goal behind a show like this is to entertain you. It's not like a documentary where its primary reason for being made is to inform. This is not meant to inform you. It's meant to entertain you. So it kind of leads into a little bit of that territory, kind of being a little bit one-sided, because that's kind of how stories work. There always has to be some antagonist, some bad guy that you kind of have to root against. There has to be something to root against, and there has to be something to root for. And I think in stories such as this one in Waco, there really isn't a particular bad guy. And honestly, I think the show kind of makes David, the cult leader, out to be a little bit more of a good person than he really was in real life. I read somewhere where some children that actually got out of the cult were testified against David, saying that he actually molested them when they were like 10. I mean, it's kind of easy to believe, knowing, because, I mean, even in the documentary and in real life, David married, like, he had like 13 wives. Like, all the men were celibate in the Branch Davidians, and basically David married all of their wives and had kids with all of their wives. So it's kind of crazy. Like, no one can have sex but David and all the women, all of his wives. And that's it. So the guy was kind of very manipulative. I mean, most cult leaders are. And he was kind of a shitty dude. Like, I mean, they definitely play on that a little bit in the show, but not as much as I think they probably should have. Because you did feel bad for David a couple of times in the show, and when I was like, look, that's me being ignorant, going into it ignorant, and then after the show, I decided to look into it a little bit more. I was just like, oh, David was kind of a piece of shit. And they kind of really, like, when you're finished watching the show, you, like, the clear bad guys are the FBI and the ATF, because they're pretty much just there to kind of, for their own benefit. You know, the ATF kind of wanted some big bad guy to portray their usefulness, because the ATF was kind of worrying about their funding being cut and basically all their jobs being in jeopardy, and they kind of wanted to show, you know, the government and, you know, America, like, why they're needed. That's why that's why Waco became such a big thing, because it was it was televised, and it was kind of became such a big issue. So, and also, yes, the FBI is definitely not blameless in this, and the ATF is not blameless in this. I mean, there's definitely been stories told that whether the ATF shot first, I mean, because there was a gunfight that ensued when this ATF raid happened, and a lot of people died on both sides. So, I mean, that kind of really raised the stakes here and made a lot of people act very emotionally, including the ATF and the FBI, because the FBI kind of used a little bit of excessive force. They bring in tanks. If you know anything about the true story, I'm going to spoil it. They do use tear gas, and tear gas is known to be flammable, and apparently the FBI also used flashbangs when they used tear gas, so that wasn't really fucking smart, FBI. I don't know. There had to have been someone being like, yeah, this is probably not a good idea, because it's pretty fucking flammable. And it's also like, you're punishing and you're killing the people who are part of the Branch Davidians, not just David. You know, there's a lot of people. I mean, you're punishing for doing what? Being ignorant and being naive and being, you know, easily, you know, influenced by this cult leader. I mean, they didn't do anything else other than that. You know, there's innocent women and children in there, and they fucking died. So there's really no blame. There's no blameless party here, and I think they kind of put a lot of the blame on the FBI. I mean, granted, they do a decent enough job kind of giving their side of the story, and then also giving David's side of the story, but I think they kind of, I don't know. There is definitely some bias there. But I mean, I don't know. You don't really know what's right, and that's kind of my problems with shows and movies like this. Like, they clearly have to take a side. They have to take a stance, or it's just not going to be interesting narratively and thematically. I mean, that's what documentaries are for. Documentaries are there to inform you and not be biased. That's a sign of being a good documentary. But I mean, again, with a show like this, it has to kind of take a stand. There has to be a good guy or a bad guy to mainly make it interesting. I mean, it's possible that you can, you know, not take a stand. I mean, it's possible, and it still be entertaining. I mean, but like, still, I don't know. It's hard to do that when you're trying to make something very entertaining and engaging and not really have a particularly bad guy and good guy. So it's still worth a watch, and it's still very interesting. It's still very engaging. I just, you know, encourage you guys to go in there with a little bit of a skeptical mind and, try to not be biased and try not to let it influence you either one way or the other. I mean, both sides do some pretty negligent things, and yeah, so and you're still allowed to have an opinion. I mean, you can still make up your own mind. So, and I don't think the show is real blatant. Like, it's very in your face what position they hold. So I think it's still worth a watch, and I still think it's an incredible, a really well made miniseries, and it's worth your watch, especially for the actors and the performances. I mean, a lot of these actors aren't in a lot, and they all do a fantastic job here, and their performances are where like they should be seen, so by an audience. But yeah, that's Waco. I definitely recommend it if you're kind of into these like true life, true crime type of movies or TV shows. If you're into those like the informative documentaries, it's definitely a very interesting watch. I would definitely recommend it if you're into that type of thing. So yeah, Waco, watch it or not. It is what it is. It's kind of one of those things where it's just like, you can pass on it. And I mean, it's not the end of the world. It's not an absolute must see. It's not like Ozark where you just like, you fucking need to watch it. It's not Ozark or Breaking Bad or, whatever. Like, that is, must watch TV. It's not really that quality, mainly because it's a true story. But yeah, it's a very interesting situation, and it's interesting to follow and see what happens and the different perspectives and the characters involved and the stories involved. So yeah, it's a good watch.